They whispered, doubted, and tried to humiliate her. But when Vanessa stood before the chalkboard, the entire room froze. Would she crumble under the weight of their expectations, or rewrite every assumption they ever made about her? What happened next left even the toughest professor speechless. And you won't believe how it ended. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Vanessa Carter stepped into the cavernous lecture hall, gripping the strap of her worn backpack just a little tighter than usual. The air inside was sharp, cold, and heavy, as if the very walls carried generations of judgment. She had been in rooms like this before, spaces where her presence alone seemed to raise silent questions. Was she really smart enough? Did she belong here? Yet today felt different, like walking into the eye of a storm she had long anticipated. Vanessa's eyes swept the room, settling on the seat she always chose, near the front, isolated but in clear view. Around her, other students chatted quietly, exchanged glances, or stared at their phones, indifferent. Yet, she could feel it, the subtle shift when she entered. The way conversations dulled for a second, the sideways looks. It wasn't hostility, but something just as cutting: dismissal. The lecture hall itself was built to intimidate. Towering ceilings, rows upon rows of ascending seats, and a massive slate chalkboard that loomed at the front like a silent judge. Everything about this place said, "Impress me." Vanessa knew that message wasn't meant for everyone equally. Some students, those in designer clothes with familiar last names, walked in carrying unspoken permission to belong. Vanessa, however, always had to earn it, every single time. But today, she wasn't just walking into another class. She was walking into a test. Not the kind printed on paper, but the kind where unspoken expectations weigh more than any grade. She flipped open her notebook calmly, but her stomach knotted tighter than she let on. She knew who would walk through the door next, and sure enough, right on cue, Professor Charles Whitaker. The man who had built his reputation on breaking students stepped inside. His sharp eyes scanned the room, then landed squarely on Vanessa. His lips curved ever so slightly, not quite a smirk, but something close. Vanessa didn't need him to speak to know what was coming. Today wasn't just about math. It was about whether she'd survive the storm brewing in this room, or silence it. Professor Whitaker, with his signature leather-bound notebook tucked under one arm, made his way to the podium. His sharp dress shoes echoed off the polished tile floor, the sound filling the silence like a metronome of authority. Without greeting or small talk, he flipped open his notes and casually chalked a dense equation onto the board. An intricate, multi-layered problem known among advanced students as a nightmare scenario, the kind of problem designed to confuse, to humiliate, not just to test. He capped the chalk, turned to the room, and with pinpoint precision locked eyes on Vanessa. "Miss Carter," he said, dragging out her name as if tasting its unfamiliarity, "why don't you show us what you've got?" A subtle ripple of sound spread across the room, not the usual shifting of notebooks or adjusting of seats, but the kind of collective reaction Vanessa knew too well. Whispers, quiet smirks, eyebrows raised. It wasn't just curiosity, it was doubt. Vanessa could almost hear their unspoken questions. Was she even capable? Did she even belong here? She took a slow breath, steadying herself as she closed her notebook. This wasn't just another cold call. This was deliberate. Whitaker wasn't testing everyone, he was testing her. As Vanessa stood and walked calmly to the front of the room, she could feel their eyes on her like a physical weight pressing against her back. Every step toward the board felt like wading deeper into a storm, but she refused to let it show. She had survived storms before. She took the chalk from Whitaker's outstretched hand, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second, noting how he didn't even try to hide the smugness in his expression. Facing the board, Vanessa stared at the problem. It was intricate, sure, but beneath its layers she saw what others might miss. Patterns, shortcuts, paths that weren't obvious unless you really knew what you were doing. Slowly, deliberately, she marked the board with her first step. Behind her, someone whispered, "She's gonna mess this up." Another voice replied almost dismissively, "Does she even know where to start?" Vanessa didn't react. The numbers, the variables, the problem, they made sense to her in ways that doubters never would. Today wasn't about solving an equation, it was about breaking a cycle, and Vanessa was ready. The moment Vanessa's chalk grazed the surface of the board, the energy in the room shifted. The casual, dismissive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by an almost uncomfortable silence. Each stroke she made was deliberate, her lines steady and confident. She mapped out the first few steps with surgical precision, skipping the common detours most students would take. To the untrained eye, it may have seemed like she was rushing, but Vanessa was working from a place of deep understanding, a quiet mastery that neither Whitaker nor her classmates had bothered to notice before. From the corner of her eye, Vanessa could sense the subtle changes in the room. Chairs creaked as students leaned forward. Pens that had idly twirled between fingers now hovered over open notebooks, poised to capture something they hadn't expected to see. Vanessa wasn't just solving the problem. She was solving it faster and more efficiently than anyone could have anticipated. Professor Whitaker, arms crossed, shifted slightly. His usual mask of indifference was cracking, just barely, but Vanessa noticed. His brow furrowed as she bypassed the long-winded conventional method and carved a shortcut. A path only someone who truly understood the material would recognize. Behind her, whispers broke the silence. "She's actually doing it," someone murmured. "And fast," another replied, sounding more surprised than impressed. Vanessa blocked them out, focusing only on the problem. Numbers didn't judge her. Equations didn't care about assumptions. But humans, they always did. She reached the midpoint, paused briefly to double-check, not out of doubt but out of discipline, then continued. Every line she added built towards a solution with undeniable clarity. When Vanessa finally drew the last box around her answer, she stepped back and placed the chalk gently on the ledge. The room was silent, not out of politeness, but out of shock. For the first time since the semester began, no one could hide behind their low expectations. Professor Whitaker approached the board slowly, eyes scanning every step, every calculation, hunting for mistakes. But the longer he stared, the more apparent it became there weren't any. He tried to keep his voice steady, but Vanessa caught the slight tightness as he muttered, "Unconventional, but correct." And just like that, the balance of the room shifted. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Vanessa could feel it pressing against her back as she returned to her seat, eyes locked on her from every corner of the room. Even those who had been scrolling on their phones moments ago now sat upright, watching her with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Professor Whitaker stood motionless at the board, his gaze tracing her work again, as if sheer willpower could make an error appear, but it was flawless. Before he could regain control of the room, a chair scraped softly against the floor. Dr. Emily Cross, who had been quietly sitting in the back like a shadow, stood up and stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was smooth but carried weight. "That," she said, gesturing toward the board, "wasn't just correct. It was elegant." Heads turned. Whispers filled the room again, but this time they sounded different, less like ridicule and more like curiosity and respect. Whitaker's lips thinned. His power, so often wielded with subtle dismissals and sharp questions, was slipping. Vanessa caught it in his eyes. The recognition that he hadn't simply underestimated her, he had publicly lost control of the narrative. Dr. Cross circled the board, tapping Vanessa's solution. Most students wouldn't even think to attempt this route, let alone pull it off under pressure. She turned, her eyes settling firmly on Vanessa. "How did you spot it so quickly?" Vanessa hesitated, unused to genuine curiosity from anyone in this room, let alone another professor. But then, steadying herself, she answered, "The structure of the equation? It mirrored one I worked on last year during an independent study. I recognized the pattern. A few students nodded, scribbling notes as if they were seeing the material through new eyes. Whitaker, however, wasn't ready to surrender. His fingers drummed on the desk as he tried to reassert himself. "Careful, Miss Hart," he said, his voice still sharp. "Shortcutting can lead to dangerous assumptions." Vanessa didn't flinch. "Only if you don't understand what you're doing," she replied calmly. A ripple of quiet laughter, half admiration, half surprise, moved through the room. For the first time, Vanessa wasn't the one on trial. Whitaker was, and he knew it. Whitaker's jaw tightened. His pride, wounded but not yet defeated, sparked behind his cold stare. Without a word, he turned and erased Vanessa's solution, leaving nothing but a clean slate on the board. The class shifted uneasily, sensing that he wasn't finished. He grabbed a fresh piece of chalk and wrote out another problem, this one more brutal than the first. Layers of variables, nested functions, and constraints packed into a chaotic web. He stepped aside and gestured toward Vanessa with a calculated calm. "Since you seem so confident, Miss Hart," he said, "show us again." The challenge wasn't just about the math. It was about dominance. The problem was designed not just to be hard, but to rattle her, to make her hesitate, to expose her as a fluke. Vanessa could feel the weight of it pressing down on her like a storm cloud. Some students leaned forward, expecting to witness her stumble. Others held their breath, secretly rooting for her. But Vanessa didn't move immediately. She analyzed the problem, not with panic, but with a familiar analytical calm, the same mindset that got her through countless late-night study sessions and high-pressure competitions. Slowly, she stood, walked to the board and picked up the chalk again. Her fingers barely trembled. As she began to work, the room once again shifted. Eyes glued to every stroke, every number, every step. This wasn't just about solving an equation now. It was about pushing back against every quiet dismissal, every lowered expectation she had faced since stepping foot in this lecture hall. Dr. Cross watched silently from the back, arms crossed, observing not just Vanessa but Whitaker too. The more Vanessa wrote, the clearer it became that she wasn't improvising. She had found a path through the problem's maze, one that wasn't obvious but made perfect sense as it unfolded line by line. The board slowly filled with her precise and bold solution. When Vanessa finally stepped back, chalk dust on her fingers, the room felt like it might burst. Whitaker stared at the board, but this time he had nothing to say, because there was nothing left to challenge. The silence was heavy, not the awkward kind, but the kind that demanded attention, that held its breath and refused to let go. Whitaker stood rigid, eyes flicking back and forth across the board, desperately searching for an error, a skip step, anything to salvage his authority. But Vanessa's work was airtight. Every variable, every transformation, every derivative had been executed flawlessly. Even the subtle optimization she had employed wasn't just clever, it was masterful. From the back of the room, Dr. Cross finally broke the silence. "That," she said, stepping forward with deliberate steps, "is nothing short of extraordinary." Her voice, calm yet authoritative, sliced through the tension. Heads turned. Students who had barely acknowledged Vanessa now stared at her like they were seeing her for the first time. Some looked stunned, others curious, a few even impressed. Whitaker's throat bobbed as he adjusted his tie. Unconventional approach," he said tightly, clearly struggling to maintain control of the room, "but let's not get ahead of ourselves." But the room had already shifted. The air was different now. Students who had sat slouched, bored, or skeptical were now leaning forward, eyes bouncing between Vanessa and the chalkboard. The faint scratching of pens on paper resumed as some frantically jotted down Vanessa's solution, realizing they had just witnessed something rare. Not just correctness, but brilliance. Vanessa didn't gloat. She simply returned to her seat, calm and composed, as if she hadn't just cracked open the rigid hierarchy of the classroom. Whitaker's usual dominance seemed to deflate slightly. Even his most loyal students, the ones who mirrored his dismissive smirks earlier, now glanced at Vanessa with something closer to respect, or at least acknowledgement. And then, a voice from the far right of the room, usually silent, usually uninterested, spoke up. "Could you explain that shortcut?" A student asked, hesitant but genuinely curious. The question, innocent as it seemed, was a seismic shift. It wasn't directed at Whitaker, it was directed at Vanessa. Dr. Cross smiled subtly. Whitaker, however, clenched his jaw. Vanessa took a slow breath, realizing in that moment that this wasn't just about solving a problem. This was about changing the way they saw her, and themselves. Vanessa stood once more, this time not because she was ordered but because the room itself had called on her. The student's question wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. She approached the board again, her hands steady, heart pounding not with fear, but with a fierce determination. "I noticed early on," she began, her voice clear but careful, "that the equation's structure allowed for an alternative factoring. Most people start by isolating variables directly, but I spotted a pattern, one that simplified everything before I even began." The room was still, but now it wasn't silence born from judgment. It was attention. The students leaned forward, some scribbling furiously, others watching like they didn't want to miss a single detail. Vanessa continued, walking them step by step through her method. She didn't just demonstrate how she solved the problem, she revealed how she thought, how she saw possibilities where others saw obstacles. Even Whitaker, arms crossed, jaw tight, couldn't hide the fact that he was following along intently. He might have been hoping to catch her slipping, but deep down, Vanessa could sense it. He was learning too. Dr. Cross stood at the side of the room, arms crossed, a glimmer of pride breaking through her normally reserved demeanor. "Brilliant," she said quietly, almost to herself, but loud enough for the class to hear. By the time Vanessa finished, the atmosphere had transformed. Students who had earlier exchanged whispers of doubt now looked at her with something she had fought for silently for years: respect. Not forced, not reluctant, genuine. As Vanessa capped the marker and stepped away, another hand shot up, not from the front row achievers, but from a student who had barely spoken all semester. "Could you show us another one?" His voice wasn't skeptical, it was hopeful. Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. Then, for the first time that day, she smiled. The shift was undeniable. It wasn't just about proving Whitaker wrong anymore. It was about opening a door for every student in that room, including herself. When Vanessa returned to her seat, the murmurs didn't die down like before. They grew. Only this time they weren't whispers of doubt, but of admiration and curiosity. The shift was undeniable. Students who had dismissed her minutes ago now glanced her way with a mixture of respect and newfound interest. Some even flipped back through their notes, replaying her method in their minds. Vanessa felt the difference, not just in the stares, but in the energy that filled the room. It wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about inspiration. Dr. Whitaker, still standing at the front, tried to reassert control. He straightened his posture and forced a composed expression. "Well," he said with strained politeness, "that was informative." But everyone could hear it. He wasn't in command anymore. The room wasn't hanging on his words. It was watching Vanessa. Dr. Cross wasn't subtle either. She jotted a note in her folder and gave Vanessa a subtle but approving nod. To the casual observer, it might have seemed small, but Vanessa knew. It was acknowledgement, silent but powerful, from one of the most respected mathematicians on campus. As the students began packing up, a few lingered. One leaned over and whispered, "That was amazing." Another offered, "Do you tutor?" Vanessa answered with a small smile and a quiet thank you, knowing full well that this moment would ripple beyond today's class. Whitaker, meanwhile, gathered his things stiffly, leaving without another word. His silence said more than any lecture could. Vanessa had taken control of a situation meant to break her, and instead, she elevated not only herself, but the entire class's perception of what was possible. When Vanessa finally stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, she realized something had changed, not just in them, but in her. The next time she walked into that lecture hall, it wouldn't be as the girl they doubted. It would be as the student they respected. As Vanessa crossed the quad, the autumn wind brushed against her face, carrying with it a strange sense of calm. She scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly until a text from her best friend Casey appeared. "How'd it go? Survived Whitaker's theatrics?" Vanessa smirked, thumbs flying across the screen. "Better. Made him eat his words." The typing bubble popped up instantly. "No way, spill everything." Vanessa hesitated for a heartbeat, glancing up at the towering buildings around her. Then she replied, "I didn't just solve it, I owned it." For the first time in a long while, Vanessa didn't just feel like she had passed a test. She felt like she had changed something. The room, the people, even herself. She knew Whitaker wouldn't give up easily. There would be more challenges ahead, more subtle dismissals, more eyes waiting for her to stumble. But now, they had seen her brilliance. They couldn't unsee it. Vanessa tucked her phone away, her steps lighter. She didn't need applause or validation. What mattered was simple. She had stood up when it counted, and from now on, she would make sure they remembered it. In today's world, where judgments are often passed before a single word is spoken, Vanessa's story serves as a powerful reminder that true worth is proven through action, not assumption. She faced doubt, dismissal, and condescension, yet met it all with quiet strength and undeniable skill. Like so many who are underestimated in classrooms, workplaces, and beyond, Vanessa's journey shows us that confidence isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about standing firm when it matters most. In every room you enter, you have the power to shift the atmosphere, to turn skepticism into respect. And just like Vanessa, you don't have to wait for permission to prove your brilliance. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of someone who needs to hear it, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful and meaningful stories like this. Thank you for watching.